Good morning. Brent, thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to speak with you. Again, this is Brent Mauti with his Turner Fleischer Architects, Chief Technology Officer, joining the firm right at the kickoff of the COVID pandemic, which has been interesting, I'm sure, but bringing a lot of value to that firm. Based off Toronto, Ontario, Turner Fleischer Architects, I first was introduced to at Autodesk University. I saw a presentation of theirs in 2019 about their digital practice that they've been building, and Brent has been a value add to that. And I'm excited to learn more about Turner Fleischer, more about Brent, and with that, we'll take it away and start learning a little bit more about that.
Perfect.
Yeah, Brent, I guess, do you want to start a little bit about some of your past history and why it was created Turner Fleischer and how you're applying some of what you've done in the past to Turner Fleischer and the digital practice that they've started and why it was created?
Sure, I'll start with my personal history and then what happened when I joined Turner Fleischer. So I'm a practicing architect in a couple provinces here in Canada, and I've been in the BIM side of the practice for almost 20 years now, so long before it was ever called BIM. And I was the 3D guy, the guy that loved modeling, the guy that could make the software dance, as they called me back at CH2ML. And when I started to get into our projects, they were plant focused projects. So there was piping and industrial chemicals and water and wastewater. And it was all about, very early in my career, designing systems that could be operated. And that was my first exposure to true life cycle BIM before it was ever called that. So what we were designing actually ended up on the screens of the plant operators. So very fascinating stuff. I had an opportunity to work on the London Olympics, and the challenge there was intriguing. It was, hey, we've got about 50 consultants, make them all work together. And I said, whoa, make 50 firms work together and make all their data talk? That's crazy, but we achieved it with the right systems and processes and standards. So that was fascinating. I've been all over the world doing major projects, doing minor projects, it doesn't matter. And I learned that the application of technology can be scaled and can be applied regardless. So after CH2ML, 13 years there, I went to IBI Group. I was their global director of design technology for 5 years, same focus. And then while there, I discovered Turner Fleischer, whom I've been following my whole career, contacted the partners, had a dialogue, and we decided a chief technology officer within Turner Fleischer was a timely fit for where they were right now. So with that, where Turner Fleischer was, there going back maybe 6 years or so, there was a decision that building information modeling is the way of the future. The digitization of the practice, redefining how we work, why we work, and how we deliver infused with technology. So they said, okay, if BIM is the approach, let's set up a BIM transformation team. So they did that about 6 years ago, a team of one person with reps from others across the various departments. So within Turner Fleischer, there's residential, commercial, industrial, interiors, site development, graphics. So they do signage and wayfinding, stuff like that. So a rep from each with this one BIM transformation lead. And they were starting to define how to make this shift. They all knew BIM affected everything from base 2D, standards, creating consistent drawings, quality checking design, to the development of models. But what they discovered was the one person wasn't enough. So everybody who was being pulled in from the department, it was, hey, I know you have 40 hours of project work, but can we take, half a day or a day extra? And then all of a sudden, you're sort of trying to balance client work versus this development, a new way of thinking. So the decision was, well, you know what? We can't deter from the regular jobs, quote, regular. So let's bring on a team whose regular job is the digitization of the practice, hence digital practice department. So now that team has grown to, we're at about 10 people right now, and the focus is multifaceted. So we look at digital practice and we say, okay, they have they'll touch upon various aspects. So focusing on the digitization of parts of the practice, technologies, workflows, research and development, etc. Will still reach out to the studio and harness their expertise using what we call a development team. So even though in digital practice, the majority of the focus is digitization, being in tune with what to digitize and why comes from the studio. So we have these dev teams made up of studio members. They still scrape away maybe 2 to 4 hours a week if we're lucky, but it's grabbing that expertise, defining the path forward, and informing digital practice on what requires digitization. Training is a massive branch of the DPD, and through that, they focus on what to train, how to train, why to train, and when. When being very critical, you don't want to do it too early. And then outreach via academia, via Autodesk universities where you first met us, etc. So that vision, we also manage how to BIM. So, the entire BIM process, it's fun because people look at it and think it's this massive, insane thing with execution plans and stuff. And it could be, but I like to focus that and say, just answer some questions. What are you BIMing? Why are you BIMing it? And how are you BIMing it? So what, why, how? When creeps in there as well. But if you could answer what, why, how, you can get things rolling. And then we'll know we manage laser scanning within the firm. So when we have the need, we set up the project, position it, execute it, bill it, etc. We treat them like little mini projects, 3D printing, all of those things. But it's not that, they're here and everyone must do it and burden projects. It's let's define needs, work with DPD to help build those needs and weave technological advancements into our everyday. And that's like 5 years ago till now, and we continue to grow. So the more we do this, the more of a focal point this department will be, because it really is, like, as architects, we have to know what we're digitizing and why. We have to know that it benefits us, improves our quality, and allows us to really advance in the 21st century.
Yeah, I really like how you're going there with the why first. It's not building information modeling for the sake of building information modeling. It's a means to an end, and integrating that with your doer programmers, your architects who have that experience and applying within their workflow, I think is a
Yes.
really smart, sustainable way of approaching it.
I teach at a couple colleges here in Ontario, and the first class I do is BIM myths. Well, part of the first class, and it's exactly that, where you debunk. So BIM is not Revit, BIM is not for architects, BIM is not just building. So those are the first three. Then it's that scope. Just because you're BIMing, that doesn't mean boom, scope is out the window and you just do everything. So yeah, you define the why and you focus it. And then that once those whys start to become more prevalent, that helps us internally to our department to decide what we need. So we have specialists in laser scanning, 3D printing, software development, very critical, BIM coordination, knowledge management. Now, what other streams we discover? Computational design is one we're trying to mold right now into the fiber of our being, and it'll just keep growing. And the more we can answer the why, the more informed I can be in driving this team forward.
That's interesting. What value do you see this providing to the building owner ultimately, and how visible is your BIM processes to the owner at different stages of the project?
So we think that's a hard question, because oftentimes it depends the building owner. So I did in my previous work a lot of public sector and government projects. Now we're in Turner Fleischer, we're predominantly private sector. So in the private sector, the awareness of BIM is not as heightened as it is in the public sector. So take, for example, in the United Kingdom, when they mandated BIM in 2016, it was mandated for all public sector government projects. And when I was there and you meet someone from the private sector, they're doing it because they see value internally first. So I think that's equivalent here. And then the value, the indirect value that, so you can say it's for us, but benefiting the client, is higher quality deliverables, better focused construction. So all of the typical less RFIs, less changes, more coordination, all of that good stuff. The turnover of a digital record, I think, is something quite unique. So any project now, that final record delivery is something tangible and robust for the client, not PDFs or even worse, the papers that were thrown in the drawer. So all of that in theory is bettered now. And where we have in-tune clients, then we're able to meet their demands on the particulars of the digital deliverable. And my hope is to see more and more clients driving some form of FM, something, right? That's where my excitement is. So the whole digital twin is nothing without the owner. So building that awareness and understanding of what you can do with a digital twin is important. And on a side note, when I do our internal Turner Fleischer Academy class, I do BIM and asset management. My first class, I talk about how digital twin has infused our personal lives. So I can control my lights and everything on my iPhone, and I love it. And I can start getting metrics on what I use, what I consume, etc. Bring that value with all of our design and construction data, all at the fingertips to an operator or an owner. And I say, how can you say no? Right? So hopefully, like, we just get more and more, yes, I want that, because there's power to that.
And whose responsibility do you think that is? Because you've noticed there, what you just noted was that there's a spectrum of owners that are stepping into it, some more than others, and some might need some encouragement to appreciate the value of advancing in this direction. Whose responsibility is it to start pushing some of these strategies into projects? Are we all waiting for the owners to demand it? Is it something that consultants should be pushing, contractors? What are your thoughts there?
I would say it's all of our responsibilities. So going right back to the BIM myth, if I'm doing BIM, I'm not going to automatically be doing BIM and asset management. I'm not going to be making a digital twin, but I'll be able to build awareness. So what we do at Turner Fleischer, anytime we have a design review meeting, anytime, if we're putting papers on a table, I say we're failing. Right. So I think we all start to be, especially in this COVID world, we're all digital. We could zoom in and out of PDFs. I think we're still failing with that. So you bring up the model, you start driving through, you build this awareness of, hey, we have right now an accurate digital record of what is going to be built for you in 2 years, 3 years, 5 years time. So we start the awareness, and then depending on the nature of the project, if it's a design build, great, it's now the designer and the contractor together showing this awareness. But obviously we've got to break down those legal and contractual barriers and start working as collaborative teams. Then from the owner's perspective, the more they're aware, the more they'll ask. And that helps to drive it. So we can only push so far from our end. When the owners start pushing, it's incredible. And I found that in my career, where you respond to an RFP and the RFP is riddled with a crazy BIM section. And I loved it. I said, oh my God. And sometimes you question the content of it, but at least there's content to have a dialogue right at the front, which is exciting. That was London Olympics, Panama Canal. I did work in Panama. They had an extensive digital turnover requirement, and most water and wastewater treatment plants all had something. They needed some type of process diagram to be operated on. And those all drove the consultants to say, okay, there's something we have to deliver more than just a stamped drawing. So there's a balance there, but I really, really think we all have to play our part, because it's really just pushing forward what otherwise has been a real stagnant industry, goodness, for half a century maybe.
Right, one weak link, and you're not hitting the full potential of what we can be achieving with this. Absolutely. And carrying on with that thought of infusing academia into these innovative strategies, how does that look in your mind?
Well, so obviously, I would say I think that's incredibly important. So we can target the owners as one item, but if we're infusing the fresh new entrants into our industry with full knowledge of the BIM process and then how to execute, then we're hiring people who expect this. So, when I think of 20 years ago and we were doing piping modeling, and I would be telling the piping designers, you need to select flow stream, size, material, etc., or you can't place a pipe. And they were upset. Like, you're impeding my ability to design. And I'm thinking, no, you have to know what you're designing in order to design it. And it was a very interesting dialogue. And that was because I was dialoguing with individuals who have been designing for 30 years. When people come out of school and they say, what, you would like me to draw in 2D? I don't even know how to do that. Or I would never choose to do that because I can do all these wonderful things efficiently, effectively, etc. That's what's important. So academia is critical. That's why I teach at 2 colleges formally, and I will speak to whomever will listen to me speak, podcast, whatever, because I want to infuse and instill that awareness. So on that note, when I describe BIM, I always say there's those who are BIM savvy, BIM aware, and BIM don't care. And the don't care are the worst. It's like, no, we've got to address that. I've got to move the don't care to minimum aware. If everybody in the industry was at least aware, in theory, nobody would refute it. Nobody would try to avoid it. Everyone would embrace it. And then we need the good collection of the savvy to execute. So with academia, we're hopefully ensuring, the class is aware, and then hopefully feeding the savvy with enough to actually come into the industry and be effective. And that's my hope.
Yeah, and I hope that this industry seems attractive to those students that are going through college and graduating and looking for an exciting industry, because there's so much change happening right now and how design and construction is happening, and a chance to invent how this will be working in the next 50 years. So I think it's an exciting opportunity for them. I liked what you mentioned there about the BIM don't care, BIM aware. What about for those owners maybe that are just a little BIM ignorant and they don't quite know what the next step is or the first step is? And sometimes you see that with an RFP when it just says must use BIM, and after that it might have a couple of sentences and you're not quite sure what to do for a first step or the next step. But if you had a few seconds with them, what would you do to consult them?
I think I'd want to portray to them that we're using this process to better the quality of our deliverable. And I think the promise I would give them is they'll have better engagement in our process. And, imagine, VR, AR, just simply game engine walking through the design, to instill to them that you'll have an understanding, so that the decisions, when we come to you for a decision at 10%, 30%, 60%, it'll be the most confident decision you can give us because of this ability to visualize and be aware. And so I'd focus on that aspect, and then the digital deliverable aspect. Say, hey, look, we're not just going to give you PDFs, we're going to give you something tangible for the future. And I think that helps the owner to say, okay, look, I understand it's a process. I, the owner, don't have requirements, but I can see some immediate benefits. And those benefits, I think it's critical when we as consultants talk about BIM, that we don't lose sight of the fundamental benefits. So we could talk about clash detection, 4D simulations, links to specs, a lot of good stuff. But to an owner, that's just, whoa, what are you talking about, right? Visualize. It's one of the most primary BIM goals that it was, the focus 20 years ago. And I'm noticing now it kind of gets forgotten because we're in digital twinning and all this good stuff. But visualization is still the most fundamental thing. They'll be able to review with us and visualize. And if they want nothing else, that's what I call a simple BIM implementation. Simplest BIM execution plan. We're visualizing, we're reviewing, and we're going to make our drawings and schedules. You can't get any simpler than that. It's what we do as designers, architects, and engineers. It happens. This will make it effective, coordinated, better quality, easy to portray, easy to immerse our stakeholders in. Rock on client. And if you say this to a client, how could they say, oh no, don't do that? Of course they're going to say do that, because that's what they want. That's why they're paying us. And then boom, you have an in with BIM. And hopefully the next project you roll on a little more and a little more, and it grows in the industry.
So when the conversation of whether it costs to innovate and what is this going to cost me, I assume you go down the path of, well, yeah, it costs you this, and here's your value, get out of that, and you can do the value cost analysis and see that it's worth it.
Correct, and that's, I think, another myth of BIM costs money, and that's why when I focus it, I look at those primary goals first, and I'll say, the ability to have an interactive design review session with the client costs nothing because we're using the process. And then, when you think of visualizing, we'll say, yeah, you know what? I always say I can hit print screen on my model and send you a 3D view, and you can see it. That costs nothing. But then if we say, well, lighting, materials, reflections, blah, 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 that costs a little more. So we can definitely have that discussion point. But I always say the fundamental execution of the BIM process is cost neutral. And if anything, it saves us money because it makes us better and more efficient and a quicker path to the schedule to delivery when done right. What happens when it's wrong, we get lost. We get convoluted in, the minutia, trying to achieve goals that we've never stated we want to achieve, and then looking back and saying, man, that was really expensive. But nobody asks, well, why did we do that to begin with? Fundamental grassroots first.
Right. It's almost remembering your why at the beginning that you stated, that North
Star.
Star.
Exactly.
And when you have these conversations with owners and when you execute on the project, and there's a lot of firms out there that are implementing building information modeling in different ways, that lack of governance, that lack of a standard, at least in certain countries and in certain markets, is something that I'd imagine is holding us back. What are your thoughts on what that should look like? Is that something that should come from a government? Is that something that should be done by the public sector, by the industry? What are your thoughts there?
So I'm a heavy believer in a federally mandated governance, but I like the term governance as opposed to standard, and I think that's very critical. So very proud of my history. When I was in the London Olympics, I actually got a chance to review and sit on and interact with some committees that were looking at what was called the Avanti standard. Avanti later became British Standard 1192. That's now ISO 19650. So beautiful. My name is not on the documents, but I'm proud to say I talked about it back in '05. And some of an example there, when they'd say you have to, quote, use BIM tools. They never said use Revit, use Bentley, use ArchiCAD. They didn't care. You have to have an integrated virtual representation of the design. And then they said you've got to collaborate. They said we don't care how, but they said recognize they define WIP, shared and published. So work in progress is where you build and author your stuff. Share is how you share it, and publish is a record of a deliverable. Fundamental things. And then we got to take it away and say, okay, if we're going to do WIP, you have a Revit and I have a Revit. Well, how do I share those, put them in an environment where they continually talk and allow us to grow? Hence your BIM 360s and ProjectWise and all of that. So it leads us to solutions, but the requirements are fundamental. And this is what I teach in my colleges. Collaboration is critical. And the British government took this, in my opinion, was the best approach to say, we want you to function. So it's more like a performance spec. We want you to perform certain aspects in the design process, and we leave you the freedom to figure it out. So in Canada, I sit on the board of CanBIM, so the Canada BIM Council, and I also interact with Building Smart Canada, who's a local chapter of Building Smart International. And Building Smart has direct avenues to the federal government, where they're attempting to build a governance document, laying these particulars. How do you digitize the design in construction industry so that consumers or stakeholders can leverage the information? And I think if there was a form of governance, then at any project level, I can then take the approach of, okay, there's a governance document and industry standards around the BIM process. I can now scale everything and apply it to my project situation. And I think that last piece is the piece that gets missed profusely, is the ability to scale. So I don't have to do everything. So a federal governance document will cover departments of defense, mass infrastructure and public works, mass buildings. And you know what? All of that can equally apply to the house I'm sitting in right now. It just has to be scaled. So I think governance plus scalability will lead to something that then owners can take and understand, consultants and contractors can take and interpret, and then yield a solution through some form of an execution plan to answer why, what, and how, and deploy it on their project.
Very nice. Yeah, I agree, and I look forward to navigating some of this wild, wild west as we figure out what those standards need to look like in this industry. I just want to thank you again for joining us. Any final comments or anything you'd like to share?
No, I just think that, our firms, the fact that we're collaborating and talking like this is very critical. I wish there was more like-minded professionals that would remove the barriers between firms, share the knowledge, share the ideas, and come together. Because if we all operate in isolated silos, we really won't make industry-wide differences. But when we start to work together, create think tanks, speak at conferences, schools, and governments, public sectors, things will happen. And that's what I saw in the United Kingdom. They started talking back in the early part of this millennium, and it took about 15 years for them to get a proper government mandate. And I just think our countries, I know the US, like there's different agencies with BIM mandates, Corps of Engineers, GSA, et cetera. There's no reason why what those agencies have can't go federal and just have a governance application across the board. So it's exciting times. We're at the forefront of digitization, and there's so much more artificial intelligence, machine learning, taking our data and manipulating it. And I want a world where I'm actually having an informed dialogue with my BIM authoring tools. So a very quick side note, code checking. It's one of my favorite things. So I used to be a fanatic for the building code. I still am. I want to open up Revit, and I want Revit to have a code dialogue with me while I'm modeling. So imagine if you place 4 walls. Okay, I've got a room. I want somewhere in Revit to say, warning, you're missing your door. So I put the door, then it goes, warning, due to area, you need 2. And it's just reading these things in the code, and it asks, hey, what building is this? And you say what building. It says, yeah, designer, you need so many bathrooms. And once I put them in, it starts, and I would love to have that dialogue so the code checking is happening in an interactive way versus me having to have the code and have the model and do this back and forth. And the automation and efficiency would be phenomenal. That's just an idea. One day.
One day. Very well said, especially about breaking down the silos and working together to figure this out. Again, Brent Mauti, Chief Technology Officer with Turner Fleischer Architects out of Toronto. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, sir.